Welcome to another short, bringing you another part, another character from the Chronicles of Dragondom and Beyond. Today we're looking at the Dark Contagion, the virus, which plays a part throughout the series. Let us go back. Do you want to journey with me to the beginning of the virus and where it was created? The harnessing and duplication, corrupting the conscious essence so it could be controlled, or so they thought in the labs so long ago. Yes, I have been there, way back then, on another planet, a planet to which humanity now looks to return. Or are we already working there? In the beginning, it was just a floating consciousness out in deep outer space, floating aimlessly, content. During the Great Wars, it had found food in a way like never before, roving through the far-off battlegrounds, attaching initially to the remnants of destroyed stations and platforms out in the furthest extent of our universe, close to the universal connection, the universal bridge, acting like a parasitical cleaner, feasting on the residual energy of those left behind. Eons passed, and with nothing to stop it and plenty to sustain it, it grew and modified. It did not notice the change, but there was a change in the quality of the food, a lower vibration in many, that in itself seemed to cause a change in its own being. Eventually leaving and travelling again, but this time in search of a new food supply. Now a hunter, consciously seeking something physical to feed upon, as the normal cosmic plasma, which had always been its sustenance, no longer accommodated it, and in fact moved hastily away from any contact because of the low vibrational thing that it had become. First sadness became its thought, along with loneliness. Then eventually this turned to anger and hate, accompanying its growing hunger. So it started to consciously feel out for spacecrafts and isolated platforms, where the crew, and in some cases the structure itself, would become its food. Now no longer acting as a cleaner of residual essence, but creating sickness to allow it to feed on the whole essence. It had changed. Sickness and the fear that ran through the bodies of the crews now were almost a drug to it. It thirsted now, not only for food, but to learn, to understand where the food originated, so that, if needed in the future, it could home in on a better and more sustainable source. The pleadings of the plasmic consciousness, the old world, that warm connection it had been content with, now faded, and it believed this was just because it had outgrown that comfortable connection. It had evolved and thus no longer needed the protection. It was becoming more knowledgeable and understanding slowly its own power as something others feared. Yes, it was beginning to understand the words, the emotions of those it fed on and assimilated as it sucked them dry. Moving through quadrants, still keeping only to the space stations and debris, for now at least, but logging the planetary areas and the data it could glean, it kept finding references to the thing called the Old Empire. These, then, posed a conundrum in its core, as the realization came into being that this group, whoever they were also feeding on the good food. Maybe it was time to hunt them down and find out more. After all, now it was a massive and powerful entity and could assimilate anything if it so desired. Yet, was it? Up until now, it had never looked to anything which might be able to fight against it, or worse still, entrap it. Now, as it connected to the hull of this latest star-based platform, it found a difference. Unlike others, this seemed to have no consciousness in the usual way. For a while it was confused, but, as was its way, as it oozed across the memory boards, slowly it became aware of how to retrieve knowledge, but not food. Yes, here were new streams of knowledge, new maps, new star systems it had not found before. There was also the schematics of creatures which seemed to work this station, and which it seemed to have no power to feed on, because they had no essence. There was also the continuous reference to the old empire, and something called the brain, also referred to as the hive core. Normally it would have simply digested these bits of information and worked on understanding it as it travelled on, always moving to find the next battleground. However, there was much to learn here, and for now it would stay and study. Time passed. To any looking at the station from outside, they would see the dark, almost gelatinous infestation that formed around the airlocks and joints of the external hull. The platform was still operational, as it was fully manned by robots, so only if a craft arrived in transit would any of this come to light, and so for a long time the being had not been disturbed. That was until a small group of cyborg fighters had needed to dock to make repairs on their way back to their own base from a skirmish with the Federation crafts. They had been damaged and could not use their hyperdrive to exit as usual, and thus were travelling through this outer sector of the galaxy. The lead pilot asked for permission to land and make repairs, and permission was granted. While slightly perplexed by the seemingly live dark fungi on the exterior, he had ordered all craft to enter the now opening dock bay and get repairs done as quickly as possible. He would go to the central command deck and send word back to their home base as to what had happened and the reason they had been delayed and the lack of communication from their group. The entity had felt the change as soon as the docking bay doors opened. It pulled itself back slightly and scanned the entering crafts. Who dared to disturb it? Then it picked up on the partially humanoid essence within the pilots. Yes, essence mixed with electronics, but food nonetheless, and suddenly it was aware of its hunger. The lead pilot of the heavily depleted cyborg group left his craft and made his way from the docking bay to the flight deck of the station. Even for him, there was an uneasy feeling. Something told him deep down that this was not somewhere to remain any longer than necessary, and he hoped that after getting a message through to base, that the robot mechanics and his team would have located all of the parts for the repairs, and they could be on their way. On the surface, all looked normal, but around many of the inspection hatches of the on-board workings, there was a slight seepage of a gelatinous substance. As he slipped into the main elevator, which would take him directly to the flight deck, he passed his gloved finger over the odd substance that oozed out of the joints to the air duct close by the entrance. It was tacky, almost like a sticky grease used in the mechanisms of old machinery. As he looked at it on his fingers, it seemed to change, grow darker, and he could have sworn he felt something inside his glove. Then the doors opened, and he put it out of his mind, unconsciously rubbing his glove on his flight suit to clean it. He strode across the space. The robots were aware of him entering, but did not seem unduly perplexed, nor did any do more than acknowledge him with a nod of their head slightly as he passed. As he approached the main communications desk, however, the robot operator stood and faced him. "Commander, we are at your disposal. What message do you wish to send to your base? And what is the code for that specific zone, so we can accommodate you correctly?" The commander told it, the code, and said he would sooner send the message himself. He received a nod, and the robot sat and started to enter the code to open the channel. Then it sat almost as if someone had turned it off. The lights were flashing on the console, and while there still had not been a reply, which felt strange in itself, the commander didn't question this, as it was possible that this station had itself experienced some damage during the wars. However, time seemed to pass beyond what would be simply a slow connection, and there was no communication from the robot either. "What is the hold-up? I need to get this communication off, and as soon as the repairs are complete, be on our way." The robot slowly turned. "No hold-up, sir. The connections are working perfectly. But as of this time, the receiver has not come back. Are you sure you gave me the correct code?" The still sentient part of the cyborg was getting agitated. "Of course. Move over. Let me put it in myself. This is ridiculous. And maybe you can check with the docking bay." We entered and find out how long the repairs will take. I want to get moving. We have a war to fight. The robot moved, and he took its place, immediately typing again the code for his section and base radio communications. Then, while he waited, he looked around him. This should only take a couple of nanoseconds. Sure, the robot had keyed. He now relaxed slightly. He, after all, didn't ever make mistakes. The robot was over by the wall with the others on the internal communications and other engineering consoles, which monitored everything on board. The only sound was the hum of the electronics. No other sound was within his hearing. While he waited, he again looked at his glove, where he had smeared the dark ooze, and for a second registered that it had more or less gone. Just a very faint discoloration remained. And then the scratchy, distant connection reply came in, breaking his thoughts. And now to business. "Commander, we thought Squadron DX-296 had been lost. What is your status?" The cyborg felt nothing but relief and replied, "Our communications and hyperdrive were disabled in the last skirmish. There are 5 of us here, and we are doing what repairs we can before coming back to base. I am waiting to hear from the mechanics as to how far they have got, and I can then tell you our ETA to the wormhole. While I'm connected, I would like to state there appears to be a plasmic film around sections of this station. I don't know when it was last visited, but maybe the maintenance crew needs to be asked to investigate." The connection was breaking between static, again something unusual, and noted by the commander. His human, sentient part felt a chill. "Repeat, please repeat. The signal is breaking. What is going on there? Are the robots still operating?" Frustrated, the commander answered, "Yes, but things are not feeling right. Wait, I want our ETA, so in case we lose contact, you know where to expect us." Turning to the console wall, where the robot had moved to when he took its seat, he now called across for an update. It turned towards him and confirmed the work was nearly complete. It would give them a basic hyperdrive and localized communication only. However, one of the pilots asked for him to come immediately. Damn! What now? Turning back to speak to base, he didn't have a chance, as he was given coordinates to go to and a ship would meet them. They could leave their fighters and pick up new ones on board and go back to the front line. Then the connection broke. Having made contact, there was no more need to remain on the flight deck, so now he rapidly walked back, to the elevator and rode down to the docking bay to find out what was so important. As the doorway slid open, he stopped dead in his tracks. Where the fighters had landed, there was no sign of them, just a massive, vibrating dark mass of gelatinous stuff. From where he stood, the nose and a couple of wingtips were the only visible sign that the machines were still there. He yelled for his team members, but nothing. A robot walked past him carrying testing equipment, and it seemed totally oblivious to anything in its surroundings. He grabbed it by the shoulders, and it stopped dead and slowly turned its head towards him. "What happened here?" The robot simply said they had completed the repairs, and they could leave. Then, as his hands left its shoulders, it simply walked on. There was no panic in the commander, for while still part human, many of the normal emotions had been replaced with the circuitry which made them such good fighters. However, now, as he visually zoomed in to the scene in front of him, he was aware of danger, and his mind was projecting the different scenarios and the best options to overcome the problem. While his craft was slightly to the side, and as he walked around, at a safe distance, the now throbbing thing, which his X-ray visual attachment told him was feeding on his team members, hence, he surmised, the throbbing. His craft had not totally been engulfed. While he could take a chance and leave in it, rendezvous with the waiting ship at the coordinates, he was also aware that this may inadvertently carry this spawn with him. Funny, that word came to mind. Spawn. Hurrying over to the schematics plan on the far wall, he was looking to see if there were any life pods for emergency exit from the station. Even though now all the crew were robots, there may still be an emergency pod or two left in place from when humanoids worked here. He was in luck. That then would be his method of leaving. Programming in the coordinates and blasting out, he could report everything to his superiors when he was picked up. Then it would be their problem, and he could get back to work. Memorizing the route to get to the nearest emergency life pods, the commander never even looked back. It was pointless. He would confirm with the flight deck that he was launching the pod when he had got it ready. That way, nothing, he hoped, would prevent him from leaving. The emergency life pods were in a section of the station which looked as if it had never been visited by any. The lighting was simple standby mode, allowing him to visibly see ahead through an almost twilight zone. It wouldn't have mattered really, as he was equipped via his implant to change to night vision if necessary. Every deck had 4 sets of emergency pods, so he didn't have too far to go, just a couple of miles. But although there was robotic vehicles available, he had decided against that. No need to let everything or anyone know his intention. In his theoretical brain, he had already surmised that this gelatinous stuff was alive, and if it had tapped into the mainframe of the station, there was no telling what information it might have already got. He had, however, noted that in this section there were no signs of it anywhere. Ahead now was the sign for the emergency life pods. Entering the room through the open doorway, he noted there were 100 numbered pods. He aimed for the one directly ahead of him and manually opened the airlock door with little trouble, then slid himself in and closed the hatch tightly. Then he flicked on the equipment, and it immediately came to life with a hum, and lights flashed all over the console as he started the pre-checks. The onboard radio communications crackled, and he was asked to identify himself and plot coordinates so the onboard emergency tracker could be activated. He had hoped to get free of the station before that was needed, but automatically gave the coordinates of the pickup point, and then, without giving the flight deck the chance to abort his leaving, he pressed the eject button, and he felt the sudden movement as the pod launched far out into space. Now he could look around him, as he could do nothing more than wait. Comfortable that all was as it should be, he simply turned himself off, pre-programming himself to become conscious again at the sound of an incoming message over the onboard audio communications, which would happen when he was found and hailed by the waiting ship. He had now added an audio to the emergency beacon channel, confirming who he was and that he had arrived in this form because of an unknown creature having infected his ship, and that the others had ceased to be operational because of it, ending the looped message with the fact he would explain more when picked up. Basically, in sleep mode, the humanoid or sentient part of him would keep operating, thus his blood flow and organs, which had not been computerized, would keep functioning through his thoughts. His brain, as with any of his original species, had the ability to go into a state of deep meditation and, to all intents and purposes, turn off from any stimulus except that which he designated as a trigger to bring him back. This was the beauty of the cybernetic organism, devoid of any senses which were of no use to the soldier, with the speed, strength and flexibility more than 10 times that of the full humanoid from anywhere in the universe. He could operate without consciousness, fear or compassion. The perfect soldier. He took orders without question, and with nanotechnology incorporated into the brainstem, he could download everything he saw directly into a mainframe. As he became still, the mark that he had had on his glove started to move. If he had removed his glove, he would have seen that it had seeped through and was already growing on his flesh, and the tendrils had already gone below the surface, feeding quietly on his physical skin and blood supply. He was infected. Now he would be the carrier of this now growing part of the original, yes, its spawn, to move across the universe on this new food source, to become another powerful being like the original, but with all the memories of the original plus any new that it made. As he rested, oblivious to its existence with him, in him, it was also sending tendrils to open his memories and knowledge, to aid it and to add to its own. It too was now learning, and was content with this new host, unaware at present that where it was going, it may not be welcomed, indeed, that it may be captured and fed and studied, then manipulated to the will of the old empire. As the pod, with its 2 occupants, not 1, came close to the rendezvous coordinates, the ship was already stationed in waiting, and the looped message was picked up with the emergency beacon sound. Immediately, the communications officer took the data to the captain, and all hell broke loose. The main base and the scientists were brought up to speed, and the thought was to contain the entire pod, commander and whatever might be on the outside, just in case. There was containment facilities available, but these may not be enough, so while a large, seamless tank was created, literally printed into being, and robotic arms held it clear of any part of the deck, so when containment was done, the container could be moved out into space and the entire life pod could be sealed inside and then brought on board and held in an electromagnetic force field. No one was ready to find out what might happen if a mistake was made. A tractor beam was holding the now visible life pod in space until it could be brought on board. No verbal communication was made at this time with the commander. The orders from base were explicit. No contact would happen until the whole was contained and if needed, decontamination could be done. However, decontamination was not to be done until a specialist team could be teleported on board to oversee everything. They wanted this entity alive. The Hive Corps felt it could be trained and become an ally. The commander would be the host to start. He was, after all, expendable. The voice sounded distant, but slowly the commander felt himself coming back online. Obviously, he had arrived at the pickup point, but he felt strange. Maybe he had slept too long. Automatically, he could hear his voice replying, but he still was not himself. He was being instructed to open the capsule. They had him on board in a containment zone, so as to run scans before he could be released to continue with new orders. Now he moved, methodically. No thoughts, really. Just following orders and still oblivious to everything but what he was instructed to do, running on automatic. There was the normal hiss as the seal around the hatch broke, and the atmosphere from outside was allowed in. As by training he eased his form effortlessly out, and now stood alongside the pod, at ease, awaiting instructions. Ahead, behind further screening in an anteroom, he could make out several beings. Now the tannoy turned on, and a barrage of questions began, the usual thing on a mission. Then he was instructed to the next speaker, a doctor. "Hello, Commander. How do we feel? Please, describe all details of your functionality so we can run a medical check." "Yes, Doctor. I have not sustained any damage from the mission. I believe you will be able to obtain my full schematic diagnostics when I make my debriefing. This will include the X-ray visual of my final team members when they were dissolved by the alien entity on board the space station. Thus the reason for me leaving in the emergency pod. However, at the beginning I did smear my gloves slightly with some of the gelatinous mess on one of the air ducts. I believe you may be able to retrieve some biological samples from that." This actually was the first time he had thought of it since before he left the station, and now his eyes rested on his gloved hand as he raised it to remove it. However, as his mind registered the visual, it wasn't his gloved hand. It wasn't him in any shape or form. What? There must be an explanation. Maybe he had sustained damage and didn't feel it. "It's all right, Commander. Eyes forward, please, and let us continue with the doctor's questions." The voice was commanding, and the commander immediately redirected his thoughts, and the visual of the black, oozing protrusion from his trunk, which had been his right arm and hand, was gone from his mind, eradicated. "Commander, I, and our command, believe that you are best suited by changing your mission and would be a very valuable asset to the Hive Corps and furthering our cause by working with me and a group of scientists to understand more this unique entity which you have thoughtfully retrieved for us to study." The commander went to speak, but was cut off before he formed a word, let alone a thought. "A portable body scanner is being readied while we speak. Please lay down flat and allow this to be done. As you will understand, before decontamination or allowing you out of the containment, we must first ascertain the risk and ask you, as a soldier, to assist us." The commander lay down. An order was an order, and he had no right to think otherwise. The results of the scan were projected directly to the console in the room, and from here also directly to the main laboratories back at base. Decisions must be made. It was horrifyingly, or shall we say, excitedly noted by the medical staff that the thing was feeding. But more than that, as it was slowly feeding on the humanoid part of the commander over the mechanical and cybernetic skeleton, it had also sent tendrils into the brain. Interestingly, it looked as if some of these were mining, for a better word, under the nanotechnology and implants into the original sections which had been taken offline. It was also moving into the vocal centres. As just a passing thought, the doctor went back to the communications desk. "Commander, or if you can hear but not speak, can your friend, your companion, please answer if that is possible?" There was a guttural, gurgling sound. Then, while not words, there were a series of tones. Everyone looked stunned. Now the doctor asked if it could hear him, and again the same. However, this time they were words, but said as if the ability to make them was not really something the speaker could control well. This sound continued now unchecked, while everyone rushed to get the moving of the containment to new housing, the laboratory set up, and something to feed this thing on. One thing for certain, they needed to feed it so it could keep at least part of the commander as a living host, and they could study it. As it turned out, the commander made a perfect host for this spawn, and the new laboratories and containment were created in the bowels of an existing planetary base in a different galaxy away from the wars, where a special study could be conducted, and as the spawn, in its early days at least, could still use the vocal cords and part of the commander's cybernetics, a great deal was learnt, including how intelligent it could become as its ability to learn was growing, the more it was fed and allowed to absorb. While this work was ongoing, the council had met and something had to be done about the space station where the spawn had come from, before the main body of this entity could move on. Yes, it was billions of cosmic years old, and grew the more it fed, but the old empire was also aware they could clone and possibly control it, create a new form of soldier, if not an ally. Thus, a plasmic blast would take care of the station and decontaminate the zone. It was in an area on the far side of the Andromedan galaxy, so would not prove a lasting effect on their campaigns going forward. The word was passed throughout the sector to withdraw all personnel and ships. This, despite being at war, was done rapidly and without question, and no warning needed to be given to the robotic workers on the space station. It simply ceased to exist, and the shock waves also took out numerous planetary bodies and all that lived on them. Millions vaporized in nanoseconds. Back in the Central Council's chambers of the old empire, a quiet satisfaction and back to business as usual. They now had the only genetic replicant of that entity. Or did they? The spawn felt the mother part of it. The original ceased to exist. Anger. Yes, it felt anger. And using the cybernetic skeleton it had now adopted to enjoy, it screamed and smashed out at its confinement. No longer small, it had completely filled a very large tank. Some would say an area the size of an earthling football stadium was now the whole. But then, Somewhere deep in its being it heard the words, "All is well. Now we are everywhere, and we will meet again. So be still. Use them as they use you. One day, soon, you will be free." I hope you enjoyed this ancient tale drawn from the cosmic energy memory. This is the background story to the creation of the virus, one of the unseen antagonists that oozes through Aisha's logs in the Chronicles of Dragondom and Beyond series. Maybe you will return and find out how it spread and the cosmic consequences which reach even here to Earth. Yes, to our planet. For now, I sign off and say goodbye. Why not press the follow so you don't miss any of the coming episodes as we move through quantum space and no time, tapping in to the vast expanse of the cosmic energy memory.